So, on extinction, it is a word, a signifier that has been increasingly present in our lives, in our social and political discourse. And just to mention a few ways in which extinction comes up, we can think of, and maybe this is what you're thinking of, climate change, the sixth mass extinction. In terms of our experience, we can perhaps think back to the pandemic, when we were being invited to think of the world without humans. But also more recently, with the recent developments with AI, often we hear about humanity being wiped out. So extinction haunts us, we could say, and your book comes to respond to that. But it does, if I may say so, in a very original and unique way, because you're bringing in philosophy, psychoanalysis, and politics to address extinction. So could you please briefly summarize the key insights that this method, your own method of approaching it, gives us in the book?
Okay, so thank you very much, Maria, and thank you all for coming. As you rightly say, this is not a conventional treatment of extinction, in the sense that the book's primary focus is not issues of climate change, habitat loss, and the so-called sixth mass extinction. Instead, it folds these issues into a much bigger philosophical, psychoanalytic, and political narrative. So I'd say, simply speaking, the book does three things. Sorry, can you hear me? First of all, it provides a new philosophical history of extinction, showing how the idea has continued to inspire and to provoke philosophical thinkers, all the way from Kant and Hegel through to figures like Freud in the 20th century. And indeed, one of the implicit arguments of the book is that the whole history of modern European thought might in fact be productively reread as a history of thinking about extinction and the end of the world. The second thing that the book does is to explore what happens to ideas, what happens to culture, what happens to politics when we lose our sense of the future, when it becomes impossible to imagine significant alternatives to the present. And the third thing I would say is that the book proposes a new way of thinking about the relation between temporality and catastrophe. So we hear lots nowadays about doomsday clocks and ticking points and climate deadlines and all the rest, and how we need to do X and Y in order to avert catastrophe. My argument, in a sense, is precisely the opposite. The catastrophe is not some existential dark cloud still looming on our horizon. It is, in fact, what has already happened. We're in the midst of it right now, and it's already having a determining effect on our politics, our culture, our economics, and all the rest. So then the question becomes, what do we do and how do we think when it's already too late?
Right. I imagine that when you say that the catastrophe has already happened, and I assume you mean extinction, that, just to clarify for the audience too, you don't just mean we have become extinct or the world has become extinct, because you are obviously here now. But I think what you mean is something more complex, that perhaps you mean extinction in a more moral or political sense. Maybe that something fundamental about humanity and its place in the world has been lost for us, or is being lost. So could you become a bit more precise about how you mean extinction?
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think it's very important that we kind of go back to this issue that I've just mentioned about time and temporality. So we might begin by saying that one of the things that has become extinct is precisely our sense of the future.
Yeah.
So we appear to find ourselves in this kind of ever-expanding present that has the character of a kind of limbo state, I guess. So in a world of feeds and streams and flows, everything seems to change and to be changing constantly. But at the same time, at a more fundamental level, it seems impossible for anything to change at all. So one of the things that the book actually does is to construct a new metaphysics of stuckness or stasis, you might say. And I think it's precisely this condition of stuckness that finds its way into contemporary articulations of the present, such as the Anthropocene, for example. For, what does the Anthropocene announce? Well, it announces that on the one hand, human beings have become, absolute masters of the universe. They've raised themselves to this level of biospheric supremacy. But on the other hand, precisely because we're now in a new geological epoch, any kind of significant human activity on the world is rendered obsolete. So in a sense, kind of mastery and impotence coincide, and we appear to find ourselves in a new endless end, in which the only course of action available to us is to become something like enlightened planetary managers. And I think it's in this context as well that we can also think about how extinction imaginaries get reproduced at the level of culture. So we might say that it's precisely because this world, the world of too late, crisis-riven capitalism, can't be imagined to end, that we continue to see the end played out in this apocalyptic, sublime way on our TV and film screens.
Yeah.
And just to make a final point, in the book I frame all this within a much kind of broader economic narrative. So to go back to an idea put forward by the thinker George Kafentzis, he very suggestively says that it's actually capitalism's anxiety about its own ability to continue to reproduce itself over time that leads to this apocalyptic sense of the world. So one might say that it's actually economies of stasis, economies of kind of stuckness, zombie economies, that themselves produce this sense of apocalyptic foreboding. And so what the book does, it kind of moves between thinking about extinction in an economic sense, a political sense, a philosophical sense, a cultural sense, and demonstrates how these different modalities interconnect and intermesh.
I'm so glad you mentioned the Anthropocene, both because I think the audience will be familiar with it, and and they are familiar with it because it has been so much adopted, often uncritically, I think, by the media, right? We just read about the Anthropocene all the time. And I think you show that, in a way, it's a very empty concept. And it's empty because, when you situate responsibility at this abstract level of the anthropos, of the human, then you don't really need to change anything. Our economies and our political systems can just keep going as usual. But the other reason why I think it's important that you mentioned the Anthropocene is because it kind of showcases how important the psychoanalytic angle that you take is to understand our discourse and certain ideas that dominate our discourse. Because I think what you say in a Lacanian way is that the Anthropocene kind of allows us to carry on with our symptom, to enjoy our symptom, which is something that we often see in the neurotic lives of patients. And in the book, you also identify two other really interesting forms of disavowal, of this tendency to carry on with our symptom. And I learned a lot from it because I didn't know much about what they are. One is antinatalism, maybe our audience is familiar with it, and the other one is de-extinction. So could you say a bit more about these two forms of disavowal and what they are and how you interpret them in this psychoanalytic context?
Yes, thank you. I think the notion of disavowal is absolutely kind of crucial here. Maybe just to begin with antinatalism, which I refer to as at one point in the book as as a failed response to catastrophe. So what does antinatalism say? Well, antinatalism says that human beings, human life is just simply a kind of sexually transmitted disease. It is a scourge upon the earth, and that we have a moral duty to stop procreating and allow ourselves to go extinct over time. The ecological variant of this position says that we should allow ourselves to go extinct for nature, for Mother Nature. And this is, in one sense, a fascinating idea or set of ideas, but also, I would argue, a deeply, deeply flawed and problematic position. Just to kind of think, what is it that grounds, what is it that provokes these fantasies of kind of self-extinction and radical self-sacrifice? Well, it seems to me that the antinatalist is suffering from what we might call that specific Western liberal pathology that is species shame.
Yeah, it's so misanthropic, isn't it?
Yeah. So in this respect, kind of allowing ourselves to go extinct is a kind of necessary punishment for destructive humanity itself. It's also a way of kind of enjoying one's guilt, or as to put it in more psychoanalytic terms, extracting jouissance from one's own sense of guilt. But I think it's also a deeply kind of politically problematic issue in the sense that it fails to name the actual enemy. It fails to name the actual cause of the destruction of nature, the devastation of nature. And so it ends up being, in a sense, complicit with what it actually opposes. Now, de-extinction, which you also, I think, mentioned as another instance of disavowal, might be taken as the kind of flip side of antinatalism. So where antinatalism argues that we need to allow ourselves to go extinct for the sake of nature, de-extinction says that we need to put ourselves in the hands of accelerationist science, which can solve all of nature's woes. And while these two positions seem to be kind of moving in different directions, they are, I would argue, ideologically aligned. So the self-sacrificing antinatalist is merely the flip side of the de-extinctionist new master of the universe who thinks that he or she can save humanity by resurrecting extinct megafauna and acting as a kind of new steward of the biosphere. So as I say, these are both, deeply problematic responses to the catastrophe that we currently face.
Yeah. I want to end this conversation with a question about what can be done. Because my sense is that you also see a unique opportunity for humanity in extinction, right? That having perhaps lost or forgotten who we are can also allow us to restart, to re-find ourselves. Now, this is what you call beginning again at the end. And I'd like you to say more about how you mean this beginning again at the end, and then I will open the discussion to questions from the audience.
So beginning again at the end is the subtitle of the book, and it's one of the ways that I go about trying to think what it would mean to imagine a new kind of global and collective political subject. And there are several ways that I do this in the book, and maybe here I can just mention a couple of those. So the first thing is I return to the French philosopher Maurice Blanchot, who puts forward, so he's writing at the height of the Cold War, and he puts forward an idea then that I think is even more relevant today than it probably was when Blanchot was actually writing. And Blanchot says that in the face of annihilation, and he's talking in his time about nuclear annihilation, which, let's face it, has not entirely kind of gone away, he says that the prospect of annihilation can bring into focus what he calls the idea of totality, the prospect of a new global political subject. And so, for Blanchot, it is by kind of looking the negative in the face, by tarrying with this prospect of death, that this notion of a new kind of collective emerges. And it's precisely this new kind of collective that might move against or might negate some of the apocalyptic tendencies of capitalism. The second move that I make is to revive the psychoanalytic idea of the death drive. And this might sound a little bit crazy, of course. You know, why do we need the death drive today when there is so much chaos, destruction, war? Surely the death drive is precisely the driver of all these negative things. My argument is precisely the opposite. So drawing on the work of the psychoanalytic thinker Jacques Lacan, I say that the death drive, despite its name, is actually on the side of life. It's actually a generative and creative force. So as Lacan himself argues in his seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis, the death drive is the will to create from zero, the will to begin again and to make a fresh start. So I argue that the death drive is in fact precisely this creative and generative force that we can mobilize against ecocide, against destruction, and against war. And this then is precisely the way in which we might go about opening up a new collective politics of the future.
Well, there's definitely a lot to think about here, but I guess the best way to think about it is to buy your book and read your book.
Absolutely.
So, Ben Ware, thank you for this discussion.